Hi all, this is your Professor Ian. Welcome to week 13 of English 68, Intro to Myth. That means we have just over a month left. That's intense. We're done on, May 19th, so less than 5 weeks left. So, anyways, this week we are reading the last few books of Homer's Odyssey. Now, we're skipping about a dozen books of this poem, so, a bigger chunk than we missed of the Iliad. So please do read the summary that I posted. The entries are very small. It's not like the Peter Green summary, which is a little more exhaustive. These entries are very small, just give you an overview of what's happening in each book. There's a whole chunk that focuses on Odysseus as a storyteller and noble guests to the people who take him in. And of course, we're skipping over Odysseus' first moments and, not even just moments, but his return to Ithaca. There's a fun moment when Argos, that's Odysseus' dog, recognizes him, even though Odysseus is disguised as a beggar. Argos recognizes him and tear rolls down his eyes. It's a fun moment, but we're not going to read it together. So even though we're not doing a deep dive into this chunk of the poem, it's really interesting and useful to think about the structure of the Odyssey, because the Odyssey is much more confusingly structured than the Iliad. The Iliad is very straightforward, right? We're in the middle of a battle, a couple weeks transpire over the course of the poem, and it's all there's no flashbacks, there's none of the stuff that happens in the Odyssey. The Odyssey is much more all over the place, as I talked about in my lectures. So the Odyssey, the first 4 books, people call the Telemachy. So it's about Telemachus, Odysseus' son, and he's journeying out. We read the first book, so we saw that, and people were, of course, a little bit flummoxed when they first read that and said, well, what are we doing here with Telemachus? Where's Odysseus? But that's the Odyssey. And then we do get, books 5 to part into, into 8. We get this voyage of Odysseus trying to get home. Then we get what's called the Great Wanderings, books 9 to 13. This is where we get all the great adventures. Right, and we read from this too. We read book 5 last week, which is the beginning of Odysseus's return home after 7 years. Remember, he's been at sea for 7 years trying to get home, and we only meet him then. Right, we get some flashbacks later. He tells us about this, what happened in those 7 years. But when we meet up with Odysseus, it's been 7 years. He's alone. He's with Calypso. And then we get the Great Wanderings, where he's telling these stories about his adventures, and that's the great stuff we read with Circe and all that fun stuff. The Cyclops, right? The island of the Lotus Eaters, and there's stuff we didn't get to read. So please do read. If you like the adventure stuff, we only read half of what are considered the Great Wanderings. But then after that, after book into 13, we get Odysseus' return to Ithaca, right? Remember, Odysseus is the king of Ithaca. He's the ruler there, but he's been gone for 20 years by the time he gets back. The Trojan War was 10 years. He sailed out, fought the Trojan War for 10 years, and then 10 years to get back. So here's the king of Ithaca returning after 20 years. And so almost half of the poem is set on Ithaca. Right, you get these great adventures that we read and all this great stuff happening, but even if you include some of the beginning part, which is set on Ithaca, like a lot of the poem is set on Ithaca, and I think this is surprising for most students when they first read this text. Is we usually do not think of Odysseus disguising himself as a beggar and sneaking into his palace when we think of the Odyssey, right? I think the public imagination of the Odyssey, we think of Cyclops and Circe and the Sirens and Scylla and all the monsters and the adventures, right? And it's interesting to ponder why this poem is best remembered for just a few books in the middle, right? Just editing one thing. Why in the public imagination and if you ask somebody on the street, what do you know about the Odyssey? They would probably tell you about the Sirens or the Cyclops or Circe or something like that. They wouldn't talk about Odysseus pretending to be a beggar and getting beat up by another beggar or fighting with another beggar for taking his spot, which happens. We're not reading about it. It's also interesting to consider what Homer is up to here. In the Odyssey, Odysseus encounters a number of hostile non-Greek folk and loses more and more of his crew. Eventually, he's stranded alone. And this is when we meet him in the beginning, well, in book 5, right? He's stranded, he's alone, he's been at sea for 7 years. He's been away from his kingdom and his family for 17 years by this point. And he's stranded alone until the gods, and mostly Athena, right? Athena finally gets permission to help him. They allow him to carry on and make it home. He's been kept from home by Poseidon for the most part, and his own mistakes. Then in a section we're not reading together, Odysseus finally meets some people who recognize his nobility and share the values of philoxenia, which I talked about in my lectures last week. Right, this hospitality. Hospitality is a super important value for the ancient Greeks, up there with Kleos and Ados and all this stuff. They take him in and they get him home eventually, even though it kind of makes Poseidon angry that they help him. But that's not the end, right? He gets home, but that's, the first half of the poem. Instead, for the second half, Odysseus struggles, and he has to use all his wits to overcome the suitors, right? The suitors are this group of men who want to marry Penelope and take over as king of Ithaca, right? They want her to declare that he's dead. He's been gone for 17 years, 20 years by the time he makes it back. So 20 years, they want her to move on and, choose a new husband, a new king of Ithaca. Where was I? Right, so he has to use all his wits to overcome the suitors and others that would prefer for the king not to return. This the second half of the book is filled with challenges, right? It's like a series of challenges that Odysseus must face, and it's all using his wit, and he's sneaking around. Well, except for one good one that we're going to read about in book 22. And this includes Penelope's challenge in book 23, which we'll read as well. But that's not the end of the poem either, because there's another book, book 24. And some scholars think that book 24 is an add-on, that it's not part of Homer's original text, whatever that means, right? That Homer exists, all that stuff. But it's not part of the original version of the Odyssey. And it's, they think it was added on by later authors, a coda to address other kinds of things. As you're going to see, book 24 is very anticlimactic. After all, in book 23, and spoiler alert here, Odysseus finally overcomes the last challenge and takes his rightful place on the throne. So shouldn't the story end there? Right? He's made his return home. In a way, the ending of the Odyssey is much like the ending of the Iliad. As I discussed a couple of weeks ago, the Iliad is not really about Achilles so much as about Achilles' wrath, right? In a similar way, the Odyssey is not so much about Odysseus, is about his nostos, his heroic return, right? He's the hero that goes out into the world, experiences all these things, has these adventures, comes back and changes his society, right? Improves, enriches it through his heroic endeavors. So the poem, the Odyssey, it's about his journey, the journey of Odysseus. It's much more about his nostos than him specifically. So it's similar to the Iliad, I would argue, in that way. In book 24, we see that maybe this return is not so easy. Returning to the world is not just about murdering a bunch of people. You'll see what I mean in book 22. Rather, returning home requires sacrifice and diplomacy. And maybe it's just not possible to return home, right? Maybe home changes just like the hero who ventured out. So, although some scholars read book 24 as an add-on, I think it's a wonderful twist on the narrative, because it could end at 23. Oh, everything's great, I'm home. But in 24, things are complicated, as we see, and that's how it is, right? Especially when soldiers return from war, right? Things are not. It's not over. It's never over, and I think that's what we see in book 24. Things don't end. So, anyways, I posted a number of resources to help you think about the themes of the Odyssey. They're totally well worth watching. I would watch them all if I were you. There's also a reflection and a Flipgrid video to post as per usual. Finally, if you've not reviewed the instructions for the term paper, please do so soon. The proposal for your project is due next week. So please do look that over this week and start thinking about what you want to work on. and start working on those proposals. Okay, so if you have any questions or concerns, you can email me or come on my office hours on Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. Thank you very much.